The other one is, how do you approach site allocations? You know, you got the money. Do you give your sites discretionary dollars and say, guess what? You can have field trips again, and here's your pot of special money. Or are you placing priorities and some local restrictions and essentially creating little block grants or categoricals for your sites? Because there's nothing in the law that either requires or prohibits allocation practice with this. Okay, so there's a whole set of local policy priorities around handling site allocations. And then the question is, how does this affect your district and school planning? And you know, I mentioned the timing issues. Right? This would have to be in place before your budget can be approved. So would you try to plan earlier? There's also expectation as things change in your budget, you're presumably changing your plan. And so how do you change what your planning is from a timing? Then there's we have different kinds of resources, so do we have different kinds of discussions since we're not going to be constrained by an EIA conversation? We will have more flexibility, presumably, and you know, what will that look like? So these are, to me, are the last three questions are really the operational pieces. Like what do we need to start talking about in our districts if we're going to get ready for local control funding? But I'd also say, I think those are the things we have time to answer. So for those of you that are, you know, you looked, your district superintendent or CBO or yourselves looked at what the Department of Finance put out and you said, okay, we got to start planning because this is how much money we're getting. I'd actually say a little bit of a timeout, because that is the proposal, and rarely do we in our state take the governor's proposal and make it lockstep exactly what shows up on July 1 when the budget goes into effect for our state. So is it probable that we'll have a budget and figure this all out by July 1? I think so. I mean, we've changed our laws. You know, our legislature has to pass a budget before they, in time to implement on July 1, or they don't get paid. And so there's been some motivation. So the issue now is, will it be a real budget or will it be a fake budget? Okay, so we don't know. And so, but here's the thing. You can plan right now for current law. What does current law say? It says you have what you have, and some of that actually is in the form of economic impact aid. And if you plan that way, you can't really go wrong. And the reason for that is because if you looked at all your numbers and you did your math in your district, you actually probably got the same or more when you look at those allocation amounts. And so the issue under current law is, if I plan to have that I'm going to have the money, it's going to be like EIA, well then I don't have to unplan or start planning really, you know, in a haphazard way during the middle of the summer when we finally get a budget. And even if we get the budget passed on time, and this is apparent, there's still going to take time for the Department of Education to provide guidance to all of you, and regulations perhaps for how this is going to happen. So, you know, there's going to be a need, I think, to transition. And so if you plan for the most restrictive scenario in mind, you really can't go wrong. In fact, you make it so that you actually have the greatest opportunities for flexibility to do something different. Right now, if you go down the path and say, okay, it's local control flexibility because that's what they said, and they even published a number, so that's what we're going to do, and it becomes apparent in June that that's not happening and we're still in our current structure, and you've already told sites that we have this flexible money and they don't need to worry about English learners the same way, how do you take that back? So my recommendation is follow current law, because you're going to actually need at least a year to transition all your sites to thinking something different. You're going to need a year to transition your central office and your leadership teams into thinking something different. And if you were doing a really good job planning and prioritizing and having those discussions, this actually doesn't change anything. So, you know, let's take next year to plan. And let's not rush to say, okay, it's all flexible, let's stop doing some things. Because quite frankly, within what you're doing, some things are working. And so how do you recognize what that is so that as you design, remember the first leading words here is local control. As you design what local control means, What does it mean with respect to your priorities for students and how you want to see sites and your staff and community interact with the available resources? And, and then there's the part that's the funding formula. That's just a calculation. So really, I think we have to seize on this opportunity to take local control. And that's only going to happen if we actually aren't waiting for the state to tell us what to do, but we take some space and time to figure out what we want to do. And we're in a state where we've had a culture where we do what the state tells us to do. When they give us money for books, we buy books. When they give us money for an extra day of professional development, we add data for professional development. We've done that for decades, okay? So to think that we're going to undo all of that thinking that, well, what does the state require? It's not going to happen overnight. So we need to give ourselves some time to get into a new mode of operating in order to, I think, demonstrate we can do this really well. So first I'd start with, it all hinges on having goals, right? You got to have like good goals because they keep you oriented if you choose to follow them. So this is where I think if you think about the LEA plan goals, a lot of us have aligned around No Child Left Behind goals, which, by the way, even the state's not asking of us to align to, because saying that you're going to reach 100% proficiency next year isn't really realistic for most of us. So part of local control is thinking, what's the goal or what's the thing that we want to focus and we actually want to follow? And you could do the SMART goal thing, and I was just facilitating a session with a group of districts, and we talked about SMART goals, and then I realized that we can write a goal that sounds smart, but it has no person involved in the goal, right? So we went around the room, and there were all these people that were insistent, like, I have a SMART goal. I said when it'd be done, and I said what percent, and I said who would do it, and I was like, sure, but like, are you going to do anything about this? Well, I don't know what it means, is what I got in response. So, to me, we've long stood by this notion that goals had to be, percent and time. I will achieve this percent by this time. And we're at a point where I think, we need to make this real for ourselves in terms of, and sometimes actually having an objective is better than the goal. Because what we've done is we focus so much on the goal, and then we jump to strategies that we never think about the objective. If I really just need to have some focus, and I think this notion of follow them, it's sometimes more useful to say, you know what, we've really looked around, and we need to deal with, literacy and having students feeling engaged. And so we're writing our objectives around that, and so therefore our strategies become something around what it takes to make a student literate and what it takes for teachers to engage their students and for students to reflect in their progress on what engagement means to them. And so those aren't goals you would find. Now, can I measure that? Yeah, sure. I'm going to measure that based on student outcome. I'm going to measure that based on participation, perhaps in terms of trainings. I'm going to measure that based on my formative scores. So there's lots of ways to do it, and it need not be packed into the statement. So as you think about local control and you think about what this is going to mean, take a chance to say, hey, we're going to have to write these plans. We don't need to think about them like we've always thought about planning, which has been for compliance purposes, quite frankly. And so how do we make these plans about performance? And so the other piece that I think that's important to remember is you can write great goals, but if nobody believes them, that's really not helpful. And so there's another piece that complements good goals being achieved, which is actually having people in a mindset that what you're saying matters. That they actually believe that supporting literacy or all students can learn, or that we need to be engaging our students in higher order thinking, that they actually believe that that's important or that's possible. And I think we've been, again, lockstep with, we were told we have to hit these targets, and even when we had disbelief, we just knew they had to be written that way or they'd get rejected. So how do we get people and recognize where people are at to say, if we don't have the mindset to believe in our goals, we're just not going to, it's not happening. And I think there's a couple things that I'd encourage in terms of thinking about mindset. One is that when you write things down and you say, hey, this is how I want to use resources, that you actually are thinking, we're planning to get something done. meaning you actually are going to do it. You're going to implement something. And I think we are really good, not just in this state, but around this country, writing compliant plans that really never, the reason we can use them over and over is because they never get implemented. And so